Hello, and welcome to the View from Sibos 2020, held virtually for the first time ever. I'm Joy McKnight, Managing Editor of The Banker, and with me via video link is Natalie Blyth, who's Global Head of Trade and Receivables Finance at HSBC. Natalie, thanks so much for joining me.
You are welcome. It's been a year like no other, Joy.
How important is trade in securing a resilient recovery from the global pandemic? And then also, can trade be a force for good?
So I think what we've got here is, as I said, a year like no other. It's a health crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a trade policy crisis. That's not the same as the global financial crisis. We have a resulting systemic downturn in the global economy, and trade has got, I think, three roles to play. One is in the immediate response to COVID and keeping those critical goods moving, and the industry as a whole has done a fantastic job of that to date, especially against increasing policy sort of blocks. And then secondly is the role that it has to play in the global economic recovery, and that's absolutely front and center. And then thirdly, I think it's in the building back better, a more fairer and inclusive society. It's that third one that really worried me actually at the beginning, because I thought, ooh, pressures on corporates, it could go either way. Did they have enough capacity to really focus on the sort of ESG agenda? But I am really relieved that COVID has proved to be an accelerator. And our Navigator survey has really demonstrated that 85% of the corporates are seeing environmental sustainability as an increased priority. And I also think COVID has definitely put a spotlight on the S in ESG, and which should help us drive a fairer, more inclusive society. And I think the key to doing that actually is going to be using tech as an enabler, such as getting access to trade finance and closing that elusive trade finance gap.
And I know that HSBC and the Boston Consulting Group released a report recently called the $10 trillion case for open trade, which really talked about how protectionism in trade really can cost the global economy $10 trillion. Can you talk a little bit about the modeling of that report and the findings?
Absolutely, it's a huge number, and it's research that HSBC and BCG did together to support the B20 Trade and Investment Taskforce. We wanted to make the Taskforce policy based on sort of fact. We wanted to put a number on the difference that G20 decisions could make. And we found the answer, and it is that stunning tailwind of $10 trillion, and it's a case for open trade. And that's the amount that just the G20 GDP would gain. And it's only physical goods actually, so if you add on top of that the fastest growing area of trade, the non-physical goods and services, you've got even further to go. So it's a fantastic piece of research and really does make a practical statement as to what difference policy decisions make.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the B20 Trade and Investment Task Force, which you're a member of. I know it's developed some policy recommendations for the G20. What are those recommendations? And then, how does this really unlock that $10 trillion for open trade?
I love your questions because you always bring it back into the practical, and here we go. Let's unlock that $10 trillion. So a good challenge. The B20 has been a real privilege actually, and exceeded my expectations working with the very wide team. Our aims were to be bold and ambitious, but to be really grounded in the practical, and to make sure that we had consensus across 133 task force members representing millions of corporates. And we zoomed in and focused on really sort of four areas to highlight. One was, and they're not trivial, fix the WTO, digitize trade, get the right capital treatment for trade finance, and get greater public-private partnerships and collaboration going, all aimed at unlocking that 10 trillion and closing for good that trade finance gap, which has increased from 1.5 trillion actually now to an estimated 2 to 5 trillion. And it's the SMEs and the minorities who are impacted most there. So fixing the WTO, if you think about it simply, it does three things. It's a forum for negotiating new multilateral deals and rules. It's a forum to ensure compliance with existing rules, and critically, it's a dispute mechanism. But we all know that all three of those are pretty ineffective today. And there's a growing consensus for a need to reform, but there's no practical roadmap, and that's proved elusive. So the B20, we try to make this practical, and we focused on two areas: the dispute mechanism first, so to make sure that we could get that settlement mechanism working better by just cutting and pasting and leveraging the interim appeal arrangement that's already in force for 47 WTO countries, came into force in April earlier this year, actually. So that was step one, just cut and paste and extrapolate across the WTO countries. And secondly, and this is the first time there's an agreement to pull in private sector here, to set up a working group involving both public and private sectors to work through the issues and bring forward specific targeted reform measures to, one, update the rulebook, and two, to ensure a level playing field. So there's fixing the WTO in a couple of seconds. Digitizing trade. Why is this so important? It makes it faster for sure, but it makes it safer and critically more inclusive. And so we have asked the G20 to just enable legislation to allow the use of electronic negotiable instruments such as e-bills of lading. There's already frameworks out there to do it, and the inclusiveness that this would enable would be a fantastic key to unlocking quite a chunk of that $10 trillion. Thirdly is the correct capital treatment for trade finance. Currently, that does not reflect the empirical default rate. So we've asked the G20 to basically reassess the mechanisms there, and we know that there's a potential to release between 1.2 and 2.4 additional trade finance. And then finally, in support of closing that trade finance gap that we're now talking about in 2 to 5 trillion, to really push for greater PPP, so that public-private partnerships, and such as the deal that we actually did with the Asia Development Bank earlier this year. And that's to get that trade finance, get that working capital to where and when it is needed. And that deal specifically focused on Asia SMEs in that PPE, so the personal protection equipment to fight COVID in Asia. And we've done that, it's oversubscribed. But the big question now that I have is, can we lift and shift and copy that and apply it to the world's single biggest problem today? And that is the vaccine. It is hugely complicated supply chain end to end, from discovery, development, transportation, and distribution on an ethical basis. Can we get the working capital to where and when it is needed? I think we can.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your insights, Natalie.
You are welcome. And I'm wishing you a safe rest of COVID.